How does speed influence skill? And how do strokes change when swimmers change how fast they're swimming? We've talked about freestyle, we've talked about backstroke, we've talked about breaststroke, and now we're going to talk about butterfly. Of all the strokes, the influence of speed on butterfly is going to be the most subtle, mostly because it's pretty difficult to swim butterfly slow. But that doesn't mean there aren't important differences that tend to show up. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. We're focusing on learning to see the key skills in swimming. Specifically, we're looking at how speed influences what swimmers do and the strategies they use. It's really important to understand these concepts because the more we can understand what's happening and what changes, the simpler and the easier it's going to be to design effective strategies and effective sets that ultimately help swimmers learn these skills. Let's check out how butterfly changes as speed changes. So the first thing we'll pay attention to is what happens upon entry. And so typically there's going to be a little bit more of an outward aspect to the fly stroke with 200 distance swimmers, and that's going to shrink as the distance gets shorter. So we can see here, this is a 200 swimmer swimming at 200, and they're right there. You can see those arms are going to slide out a little bit more to set up the stroke. It tends to be a little bit more patient, and that helps swimmers get into a little bit more efficient position that allows them to create speed with maybe a little bit less force. And so you can see here, the hands are sliding out to set up the stroke, and that tends to happen a little bit more over 200 distances as compared to sprints. We can see the same thing here with the swimmer, so setting it up, getting wider, and then coming back in. So again, a little bit more of a lateral motion in the beginning of the stroke tends to set things up in a way that allows swimmers to create propulsion with maybe a little bit less force, and they also have more time to make it happen. And then shifting to 100 distance, you can see there's going to be less lateral motion and there's less hesitation. This swimmer is kind of getting right on it right from the start, and there's not going to be much, if any, outward motion to the hands in the beginning of the stroke. So getting right on it and then starting to pull right away as opposed to being patient and opposed to setting up the stroke a little bit wider. This swimmer is going to get on it, enter right where she wants to be, and then get right into the stroke right from the beginning. And that's going to be a product of trying to go faster. They simply have less time. They can't waste time either setting up the stroke or getting into the stroke. They've got to get right on it, and they want to get water movement backwards as soon as they can. Then taking to the extreme, this is over 50 butterfly, and this swimmer does not even contest 100 butterfly, and you can see that there's no lateral motion whatsoever. He's getting right in, right on it, right away. He's not even bending the elbows a little bit. He's just letting it rip, and he's going for maximum power in the least amount of time. And so this is not going to be a sustainable stroke, but it's one that can create a lot of speed and not a lot of time, and that's in contrast to the first stroke we watched, the 200 stroke. They're going to sacrifice a little bit of speed, but they're going to get a little bit more efficiency. Here, we're sacrificing efficiency in the hopes to create more speed and less time. So again, getting on it right away, no hesitation, no lateral motion. It's all direct, it's all coming straight back, and it's trying to create as much propulsion as possible in as little time as possible. So the next aspect we'll take a look at is the amount of undulation that's present in the stroke. And again, these are subtleties. The difference between a 200 butterfly and a 100 butterfly and a 50 butterfly aren't that significant, but they are relevant. And so we're looking for general trends. There's going to be some swimmers that don't display these things. There's other swimmers that exaggerate these things. Again, it's looking for the general trend, the general concept of how things change, and then you can adapt that to your specific swimmers. So again, because one, undulation is going to allow for maybe a little bit of energy saving as long as it's appropriate. The trade-off, though, is that it takes more time, but in a 200 event, that might be a trade-off that's worth making. The stroke rate's going to be slightly slower, so swimmers can undulate a little bit more, and compared to a 50, the stroke rate's going to be a lot higher. They don't have time to do it. They have to do what they have to do in order to get the arms out of the water, but they're not going to exaggerate it. So if we watch here, you're going to see a little bit more of a chest press here, and the hips are going to come up a little bit higher, and that's going to allow her to maintain her efficiency a little bit better, because when those hips come up, she's going to be in a more aligned position, and so it's really important over longer distances to make that happen. And so some swimmers are going to exaggerate the chest press just a little bit relative to what they do in 100 or even a 50, and that's because they can let them get into more efficient positions, and they have time to make that happen. They're not going to pay a penalty by taking that extra time and slowing their stroke rate slightly. Now again, she's not burying her chest. She's not diving down. It's a slight and subtle thing that's going to be a little bit exaggerated as compared to 100. We can see the same thing here with the swimmer on the left. You can see that those hips really come up. It's kind of exaggerated a little bit, and she's pressing the chest pretty hard. And that's going to, again, get those hips up a little bit, create a little bit better alignment, allow for a little bit more sustainability. Now with this swimmer, you get the same motion, the same action. However, it's going to be a little bit less dramatic. She's still got to press the chest, but she's not diving down. You don't see the same arch of the back. You don't see the same press, and the hips don't come up quite as exaggerated. They're still right up at the surface, but there's not an obvious arch, an obvious elevation of the hips. And so it gets right up into where she needs to be, but she's swimming a flatter stroke, which is going to allow her to create more propulsion in less time, get the stroke rate up, and create more speed. And so because she has a different constraint in terms of what she's trying to accomplish, not as worried about efficiency, a lot more worried about speed, she's going to be a little bit flatter, and that's going to allow her to swim a little bit faster, use a higher stroke rate, and create more speed, which is what she needs to do to race and compete successfully. Now, if we go back to the 50-meter swimmer, you can see his head's not really even diving down much at all. So he's doing everything he can to keep that stroke rate up. He doesn't want to press down. He wants to keep everything locked in. He wants to stay as flat into the surface as he can. His hips are still going to come up because he needs to swim level. However, he's not pressing down in the front at all. You can just see that his head barely even breaks the surface of the water. He's trying to create as much speed as he can, get the rate up as much as he can without sacrificing anything in terms of propulsion. And the way he can do that most effectively is by flattening things out and not undulating and not really trying to dive down in the front of the stroke. The flatter he can keep it up top, the easier it's going to be to rate up and create a lot of propulsion and a lot of power. The final difference that occasionally shows up in comparing 200 and 100 swimmers is the presence of two really strong kicks. So if you watch this swimmer here, you can see that there's not a really strong kick as she pulls through. It's just kind of a leg movement as opposed to a strong kick. And this is an Olympic champion over 200 meters, so it's not like she's a slouch. You don't always see this. You occasionally see this. You see this more often in a 200 swimmer than a 100 swimmer, although you do occasionally see 100 swimmers that do this. I think Laszlo Sheh was one that had a pretty weak second kick. However, as a general trend, it's more likely to be in a 200 stroke as opposed to a 100 stroke. It's just something to be aware of, something to see, that sometimes swimmers can get away with it in this event. However, it may not be optimal, but it's something they can work with, and you got to be careful changing that because it might be something that's working for that swimmer. However, you see that less often when looking at 100 swimmers. So if we go back to our swimmer here, you can see two really strong kicks, one, and then two, and that's going to, one, get more propulsion and then allow her to really create a ton of power through that pull and then get that speed up through the arm recovery, which will allow her to maintain speed for a lot longer. The potential trade-off is it's going to take more work for the legs as opposed to not using that kick, but in a shorter event, the energy demands, the energy conservation is less of an issue as opposed to creating as much speed as possible, which is why you often see that 100 swimmers are almost always using two kicks, whereas 200 swimmers occasionally are only using one kick, even at the highest levels. If you want to learn how to create a powerful pull that's critical for developing speed regardless of the race distance, check out the video above.